beside her again, and I tried to fight it, to hold back, but she murmured, "It's okay," and I surrendered. A climax like a series of explosions rippling across my entire body. She lay with her head on my chest. We didn't speak. A little while later we started kissing again. We kissed for what felt like hours. It felt like a dream, like being outside myself. I know at some point we made each other come again. I remember hearing someone singing very faintly in the distance. "Un daw tri, mamin dali pri." I think I tried to remark on it, but my mouth was too tired, my tongue too heavy. The next thing I knew, it was light, and Julia was gone. I found her in the cottage. She had her hair pinned up and was sorting through some paperwork on the kitchen table. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Are you looking for breakfast? I'm afraid the schedule's gone to hell." No, of course not. Words failed me. I was as tongue-tied as a love-struck teenager. "Julia..." She got up from the table and pulled me into a hug, quietening me. It felt very much like a platonic hug. "Julia," I began again. "Lucas, let's not talk about it, okay? It was something I needed, that's all." "Oh." She laughed. "Please don't look so disappointed. I really don't want to have a long, awkward conversation about it. It felt like something you needed too. No more than that and no less. You don't want more than that, surely. I'm a mess, and I get the impression you're not ready to move on." Was she right? I didn't know. It had been 2 years since I lost Priya. I missed her. Of course I still missed her. But the pain, which used to be ever present, the overriding emotion that darkened every hour of every day, had dimmed. Now I could go for hours without thinking about her, before being shocked out of forgetfulness by guilt. But I didn't feel guilty about sleeping with Julia, because I was still here, wasn't I? Still living, still in need of human warmth and pleasure, still trying to be happy. I was certain Priya, if she was watching me, wouldn't begrudge me that. I was sure, in fact, she'd be cheering me on. It was different for Julia, though. I understood that. It was more complex because of Lily. I could move on, but Julia was in limbo. She sat back down and I joined her at the table. She pulled the paperwork towards her, arranging it into a pile. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. "The person you lost? I assume it was a girlfriend?" Yes. Yes, she was. And I told her what had happened. My panic when Priya didn't turn up at work, finding her body, the hit and run. The police found the guy who did it a week later. He was some high-ranking council official who'd been visiting his mistress before work. It was an accident. He was racing to get to the office before he was missed. And he panicked, thinking he'd lose his job and his wife and kids. I was there in court. He seemed genuinely ashamed. Kept saying sorry. But I still hated him. If they told me he'd killed himself, I'd be happy. I looked up at Julia. That's terrible, isn't it? No. It's understandable. If someone took Lily, and if I ever find them... She didn't need to complete the sentence, but her eyes reflected the hatred I still harboured for the man who killed Priya. "I was luckier than you," I said. "I got closure, and Priya's death had an unexpected effect on me. I thought if anything like that ever happened to me, I would fall apart, that writing would be at the bottom of my priority list. But the opposite happened. Priya had been so enthusiastic about Sweetmeat, which was an embryonic idea at that point, that I became determined, absolutely driven to finish it, to make it soar for her. I guess the aftershock of my dad's death was mixed in with it too, the feeling that I'd never made him proud. So I put everything into that book, everything. For the first time in my life, it was easy, and I knew it was good. And when it was successful, did it make you feel better? Did you feel like you'd done Priya and your dad proud? Yeah, kind of. It was exciting, exhilarating, but it was also kind of scary. When there's been this thing you've wanted your whole life and you think, if this happens, everything will be perfect. I'll be happy at last. You convince yourself it will fix you. And then it happens. And it doesn't fix you. No, I wasn't any happier. It didn't make me any less cut up about losing Priya or my dad. Time was the only thing that could do that. She nodded, and I went on. I was a mess. I'm still a mess, but you know what? I feel different now. After what happened to me and Max, almost dying. It's a massive cliché, but it really fucking focuses the mind. This is my second chance, my chance to get my shit together and be happy. I was silent for a moment, and she waited for me to continue. Getting to know you, Julia, has made me realise I don't have any real problems. Nothing compared to what you've gone through. You're so strong. I'm not strong. No, you are. You really are. You're amazing. I know you don't want any more from me, but I just wanted you to know that I think you're amazing. I'm not... She broke off. Hang on. We've got company. It was Ursula. She burst into the cottage and came straight into the little kitchen. Her hair was sticking up, and there was a bed crease on the side of her face. She was pale, her expression flicking between anxiety and excitement. Are you all right? Julia asked, standing up. Ursula swiped at her ear as if a wasp was bothering her. Despite my antipathy towards her, I was concerned. There was clearly something wrong. My spirit guide, Phoebe, she said. She spoke to me during the night. My concern evaporated. It was just Ursula talking her usual nonsense. And what did she tell you? First, she told me where to find your phone. I glanced at Julia to see if she was as incredulous as I was. She mainly looked worried. Oh, I said. Where is it then? On the bookshelf, in the Thomas room. I asked my guide exactly where, and she sang to me, an old children's nonsense rhyme. I stared at her. Wait here. I left the cottage and hurried over to the main house, going straight into the sitting room. I located the owl and the pussycat straight away and pulled it out. I couldn't see my phone, so I pulled out a few more books, revealing a gap at the back of the shelf. And there it was, my missing phone. On the way back to the cottage, I pressed the home button, but the phone was dead. I waved it as I re-entered the cottage kitchen. She was right. It was there. I addressed Ursula. You must have taken it, hidden it there. Don't be ridiculous. I searched my memory. Could I have put it there, on the shelf, the night Ursula arrived? I had a vague memory of going over to look at the books. It was possible. I could have rested it on the line of books, and it might have slipped down behind them. I didn't know what to think. Julia spoke up. Did your spirit guide come to you in the night just to tell you where to find Lucas's phone? Does she do that often? Tell you where to find lost things? Sometimes she does. She looked meaningfully at Julia. You should sit down, dear. I'm okay where I am. Very well. You might find this a little alarming, but I'm going to ask my guide to speak to you directly. You're kidding, I said. Julia, come on, let's go. But she wouldn't move. No, I want to see this. Ursula drew in a long, deep breath, spread her fingers out on the table and closed her eyes. She was silent for so long that I felt the urge to speak, to ask her what she was playing at. But then she started talking. Her voice was different, higher and younger. It was faintly absurd, but eerie too. She kept her eyes shut and tilted her head to one side as she spoke. Julia, your child is gone. Lily is gone. Julia put her hand to her mouth. Ursula tilted her head to the other side. But do not worry. She is safe. She is happy. She's in a better place, the best place. I've seen her and spoken to her. She wants you to know that she loves you. Her daddy is with her too, and they're happy together, even though they miss you. Julia, I said, but she shushed me. Ursula smiled, a ghastly smile that made her, with her white face and voluminous hair, look like a Victorian doll. Lily's safe now. You don't need to worry about her any more. You don't need to look for her. She's with Jesus. Part 3. Chapter 34. Ursula's eyes darted around the room, as if she didn't know where she was. She clamped her hand over her mouth. Moving twice as fast as normal, she exited the room, dashing to the toilet. I heard retching, then the toilet flushing and a running tap. When she came back into the kitchen, she was as pale as bone, and beads of sweat clung to her brow and upper lip. She sat down. "Would you mind fetching me a glass of water?" Julia was frozen still, unable to take her eyes off Ursula. I found a glass, filled it from the tap, and handed it to Ursula. She gulped it down. "I apologize," she said. "This always happens when I channel. Would you mind leaving me for a minute, until I get my strength back?" I was glad to get out of that room, but Julia was more reluctant. "She said Lily's with Michael," Julia said. "And Jesus." Ursula half smiled. "Did she? I didn't hear what was said. I was in another place." "Come on, Julia," I said, guiding her from the room. We left the cottage and stepped into the garden. Julia was in a daze. I tried to put my arm around her, but she pushed me away. "Please, I want to be on my own for a minute." "You can't believe that was real, surely?" "She knew where to find your phone, didn't she?" I could feel all the warmth between us draining away. I was convinced what Ursula had done was an act. Perhaps she was insane and thought it was real, but the idea that someone could channel a spirit who could talk through them was nonsense. I knew Julia was desperate to believe it, but it was so frustrating. I was surrounded by superstition and irrational beliefs. What next? Was Ursula going to claim that a woodland spirit knocked Max and me over the head with a rock and chucked us in the river? She probably hid my phone in the first place so she could set this up. Next, she'll be asking you for money in exchange for messages from Lily. Julia started towards the house, but stopped and whirled round. She jabbed a finger towards me. "You don't get it, do you? How it feels." She thumped her chest with a flat hand. "You tell me I'm amazing." She made air quotes with her fingers. "For what? Being strong? Holding it together? You have no idea." Ursula had come out of the cottage and was watching us. Julia ignored her. "You don't know how much it hurts, Lucas. No idea how many times I've been down to that river and thought about throwing myself in, knowing I'd drown because I'm so weak I can't even swim. If someone showed me proof that Lily was dead, then maybe I'd do it. There'd be nothing to stop me anymore, no hope left to keep me alive." She waved an arm at the house. "I thought when I opened the retreat it would give me some new purpose, a business to run, something for me. What a mistake." She began to laugh, on the edge of hysteria. "I should have gone with my original idea and opened a boarding kennel. Dogs might be needy and difficult, but my God, they're not half as needy as you writers." She turned her attention to Ursula, who still loitered by the door of the cottage. "So, what should I do, huh? You telling me Lily is dead, 100%? Should I give up hope? Should I go and throw myself in the river?" "Julia." She cut me dead with a glare and took a step towards the cottage. "Come on, Ursula. What does your spirit guide say? Does Lily want me with her now?" Ursula clung to the doorframe. It was scary how much she'd aged almost overnight. "No, Julia, she doesn't want you to join her. I expect she wants you to find the person who did it to her, the person who killed her." Julia and I both stared at her. "And did your guide give you any clues?" Julia asked, her voice hard and cynical. At least I thought. She doesn't seem to believe Ursula now. Her anger had burned away the belief. "Not yet," Ursula said. "Well, give me a call if she does. I want you to go. Pack your bag and go home." I couldn't help but smile until Julia whirled round to point at me. "You too, all of you." She gestured to Susie, who'd appeared by the front door of the house. She looked a mess, pale and shaky. She seemed almost relieved to be given her marching orders. She hung her head and went back inside. "The police told me I needed to stay nearby," I said, after Susie had gone, aware of how pathetic that sounded. "Get a room in town, then," Julia snapped. She stormed back to the house, leaving Ursula and I alone. "She doesn't mean it," Ursula said. "She'll calm down. She's had a shock, that's all." "Yeah, and whose fault is that?" I said, as she followed Julia into the house. I walked down to the fence and looked out at the surrounding countryside. I touched the bandage on the back of my head. A few hours ago, Julia and I had been in each other's arms. Now she was kicking me out. Maybe, despite the police's instructions not to leave town, I should do as she asked. Go back to London, forget about Julia and Lily and all the rest. Try to forget that someone had attempted to kill me. Finish my novel. Get on with my life. But I was in too deep now. My mobile rang in my pocket. It was Ollie. "Hey," he said. "You busy? Do you want to pop over?" I was confused. "To look at your dad's books?" "No, well, kind of. It's just I found something that's related to what we were talking about yesterday. I think you should come and take a look." Malcolm Jones had lived alone since his wife died, in a large stone house on the other side of town. It stood alone, halfway down a narrow lane. There was an empty pond out front, and vines snaked up the facade, all the way to the guttering on the roof. Ollie let me in. He had the air of someone who hadn't slept much, and the faint whiff of body odour emanated from him. He led me into the kitchen. Heleth turned around from the sink where she was washing up. She wore a white T-shirt, and her rose tattoo was on display again. She dried her hands on a tea towel and came over to me. Like Ollie, she seemed strained, nervous energy radiating from her. Grief. I recognised it well. "It was you who found my mum," she said. I nodded. "How are you?" Ollie put his arm around her shoulders. "We're supporting each other, aren't we?" "That's right." She touched a cross that hung around her neck, and I realised it was the necklace Shirley had worn. I looked from Heleth to Ollie and back. I was still certain both their parents had been murdered, and that I was partly responsible. I was groping for something to say. I was wondering if it would be insensitive to ask about the dog, when Ollie said, "Come on, mate, let me show you what I found." He led me up to Malcolm's study, leaving his girlfriend in the kitchen. The hallway was full of cardboard boxes where Ollie had begun to pack his father's belongings. I squeezed past them into an unexpectedly spacious room, dominated by an enormous desk and lined with sturdy bookshelves. There were hundreds, possibly thousands of books in the study, crammed into every space, ramming the shelves, stacked on the floor and the surface of the desk. A shiny iMac was incongruous among the many dusty volumes. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Ollie said. "There are thousands more downstairs. You'd think he'd get sick of seeing books after spending his working day with them, but I think he was actually addicted to acquiring them. My mum was always moaning at him. 'You've got a 6-foot pile of books by our bed that you haven't read yet. Why do you need to buy more?' A section of books on a shelf to my left caught my eye. They were dedicated to folklore, fairy tales, and urban legends. One of them was Folk Tales and Urban Myths, the book that Lily had owned and that I'd also seen in Megan's house. It was clearly a bestseller around these parts. Beside that were a number of volumes about the history of North Wales and the local area, A Clean Slate, an oral history of quarrying and mining in Wales. Hardly the catchiest title. I leafed through it quickly, checking the index for Bed Mawr, wondering if there was anything about the former mine on which Julia's house stood. Yes, there it was. The mine had been at the heart of the local community, I read, until it closed in 1946. There were stories that the wife of a miner who was killed at work placed a curse on the town. I knew that already, and the book didn't offer any new information. "What did you want to show me?" I asked. He hesitated for a second. "Heleth said I shouldn't tell you, that she'd probably put it in a book or something. But I can trust you, right?" "Yes, of course." "Good, because it would be crap if you gave her the opportunity to say I told you so. There's some stuff about her in there, so she's a bit sensitive about it." I still wasn't sure what he was talking about, but said, "Okay." Ollie picked up a holdall from the desk chair. "Let's go downstairs. There's nowhere to sit here." Once we were seated in the living room, he said, "My dad kept a journal. There's one for each year, going back to 1965. They were all on a shelf, in date order. I started to look through them. There's all this stuff about how he met my mum, the early courtship, as he called it, their wedding, having me, loads of stuff about work, too, and his colleagues. Plus there are reviews of books he read and films he watched. Quite interesting, if only to me." He licked his dry lips. "But I noticed 1980 was missing. And that got me thinking about what he said to me the day he died, about keeping a terrible secret." 1980. I'd been 6 at the time. It was the year before we left this town and moved to Birmingham. My mum had mentioned 1980 when she told me about the little girl who'd gone missing from the children's home. Heleth came into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee for us. She sat down next to Ollie. He went on. You know, it looked like someone had been in there, in his study. The desk drawers were in a mess, like they'd been rifled through. There were books scattered all over the floor. Dad would never have done that. He was obsessed with things being filed correctly. So at first I thought someone must have been in there and taken 1980. Then I remembered. I was desperate for him to get to the end of the story. Dad had a hidey hole. It's under the carpet in his bedroom, a loose floorboard. He didn't know that anyone knew about it, but I discovered it when I was a kid, after I peeped in on him once and saw him messing around with the carpet. He used to hide money in there. Other stuff, too. A girly mag. He laughed. I found it when I was 9 or 10. I'll never forget it. Those bushes. Heledd rolled her eyes. Anyway, it was in there. 1980. He held the book out to me. As I was about to take it, he pulled it back. You're the first person who's seen this, apart from me. Even Heledd hasn't read it yet, though I've told her the important stuff. I'm only showing it to you because I think you'll be able to help us figure this out. Also, well, you'll see in a minute. He passed the journal to me, opened at a page near the back. I began to read. Chapter 35. Something dreadful has happened, Malcolm wrote. The date was Thursday, the 8th of May, 1980. It frightens me to put it down here, but I have to get it on paper. If the knowledge remains confined to my head for another moment, my skull might burst. I haven't written in here for a few days, so I need to recap. Let's go back to Monday, the 5th. The society met, as we always do on a Monday night. We met at the Miners' Arms. It was quiet, as usual, and we took our table in the back. Glyn had brought Shirley Roberts along to take notes. I have long suspected that Glyn is the father of Shirley's illegitimate daughter, Heledd. It was a minor scandal when Heledd was born. We don't do unmarried mothers around here, and people gossiped and whispered and called Shirley a slut, and many other names besides. I admire Shirley for holding her head high. The little girl is 6 now, and Shirley sometimes brings her into the library. A sweet little thing, who gravitates towards grown men as if searching for a father. If Glyn is her dad, then God help her. I glanced up at Heledd, wondering if Ollie had told her what his dad had written about her. It was awkward, to say the least, reading the speculation in her presence. I turned the page. Glyn had an old newspaper with him, yellow and dog-eared. He explained he'd found it when laying a carpet in a house he was doing up. Old newspaper had been put down beneath the underlay. It was dated 1945, the local paper. There would be a copy in the library, stored on microfiche. Glyn laid it out for us all to see the headline. Police abandon search for missing girl aged 5 in Bedmore. The report told her the 5-year-old daughter of a couple who'd recently moved to the area had vanished 2 weeks before. She was out playing with friends who'd ridden off on their bikes, leaving her behind on the edge of the woods. Her name was Glenys Williams. A grainy photo accompanied the report. Little Glenys on a beach in Llandudno, licking an ice cream on her last family holiday. The police had carried out a search of the woods with dogs, but were unable to find her. This is the interesting part, Glyn said. Listen. Police reported that they'd received little help from locals who seemed resigned to what had happened. A local woman who refused to be named said that it was clear that little Glenys had been sacrificed to keep the other children of the town safe. Police believe the girl must have wandered towards the nearby River Dee and fallen in, although no body has been recovered. I showed it to my mother, Glyn went on. She remembered it happening, and guess what she told me? 35 years before, in 1910, the same thing had happened. She remembered because her own mother, my gran, told her about it. She said it happened every 35 years. A child had to be given to the Red Widow, or she would come and take one. Glyn went on to tell us that his mother told him the sacrificed child was always one who would be less missed in the community. The witch didn't like sick children. They taste bad. So the local people couldn't give up a child who was likely to die anyway. He said this as if this was a terrible shame. Instead, they chose a child who'd been orphaned, or whose parents were new to the area, or a bastard. The widow particularly liked children with sin in their blood. It was not worth the risk, said Glyn's mother, that the witch would come and take a child from an important family, a son and heir, a child whose death would rock the community. 35 years, Glyn said, looking around the table. 1945 was 35 years ago. As if we hadn't already worked that out. It's lucky nobody believes in such superstitious nonsense anymore, isn't it? I said. I looked around the table at the faces staring back at me. Glyn, Shirley, Albert, David. All of us in our mid-30s now, but we've known each other all our lives. We went to the same school. David and I were the studious ones. Albert somewhere near the bottom of the class. Shirley a nervous little thing who followed Glyn around like his pet lamb. Glyn, of course, was the class bully. Now, Glyn pointed at me. How would you feel, Malcolm, if little Ollie was taken by the widow? Shirley, what if Heleth was taken? And you, David, what if the witch came and took away Lucas? I gasped and stopped reading, looking up at Ollie. My dad was there, I said. That's why you wanted me to see this? He nodded. My mouth was dry, fingers trembling as I turned the page. I certainly wouldn't want to risk her coming for Wendy, Glyn said. I could hardly believe how serious they all looked, as if they believed Glyn and his crazy old mother, as if they actually believed a witch might come into the town in the dead of night and steal their precious children away. Only Albert, who didn't have any children, looked less afraid. I banged on the table, startling them from their stupor. This is madness, I said. Perhaps a long time ago this crime, the crime of taking children into the woods and leaving them to be taken by a non-existent being, happened. Maybe, just maybe, it happened in 1945 too, though I find that hard to believe. It's far more likely that Glenys got lost and fell into the river. An accident, that's all. Except, Shirley said, speaking for the first time in that meeting, all it would take was for one person to believe in the widow. One person willing to murder little Glenys, so there was no risk of their own child being taken. I called an end to the meeting. I needed to get out of there, away from the atmosphere that hung over that table. The others lingered behind. I heard them murmuring. Glyn's booming laugh rang out as I left the pub. I glanced up at Ollie and Heleth. We'd each had a parent at that meeting, at least one, in Heleth's case. It felt strange, like a reunion. Glyn's daughter Wendy was the only person missing. I read on. Malcolm's journal entry was broken in two. There was a space on the page before the next section began. I've been staring at this page for 15 minutes, trying to decide what to write, how to tell the rest of this tale. A large part of me is shouting at me to leave it, that it's too dangerous to record, there will be repercussions. But I have to do it. Damn the consequences. How brave I sound within the pages of my journal. How brave the coward sounds. The facts. Last night, a 4-year-old girl went missing from St. Mary's Children's Home. The girl's name is Caris Driscoll. It's all over the radio and local news, and the police are combing the area trying to find her. Details are patchy, but rumours are running like wildfire through the town. It was all anyone could talk about at the library today, including a young woman who works at the home. She came in to return some books, then hung around, a group gathering as she told the tale. I loitered on the edge of the group, the blood in my veins turning to ice as I listened. Caris Driscoll was put into the care system after her mother, a heroin-addicted punk, died of an overdose when her daughter was 3. There's never been a father on the scene. Nobody knows who he is, and the grandparents wanted nothing to do with the child. They've been trying to place her in a foster home, or find someone to adopt her, but so far without luck. She was last seen at tea time, yesterday evening. Apparently the children were then allowed outside to play for a little while. A member of staff was supervising them, but one of the children hurt himself and had to be taken inside for first aid. Then the children were called inside. Nobody noticed Caris was not among them until this morning. The woman faced down the cries of incredulity in the library with excuses. There are so many children, she said. It was getting dark. Caris was so quiet, a little mouse, that she tended to shrink into the background. The staff are overworked and tired. None of the other children said anything. I'm sure heads will roll at St. Mary's Children's Home, but that won't help poor Caris. All I could think of was the conversation in the Miners' Arms on Monday night, the faces of my fellow society members around the table. I told my assistant I wasn't feeling well and left the library, leaving the gossips behind. I headed straight to Albert's house. Rhodri Wallace, another old classmate, was in the garden cutting the hedge. He was a likeable boy at school, good with his hands and popular with the girls. Now he was the most in-demand gardener and handyman in town. He raised a gloved hand when he saw me. His face was as pale and shocked as all the others I'd seen on the way over. I didn't stop to talk to Rhodri. Instead, I headed inside. Albert was as horrified by little Caris's disappearance as I was. "It has to be a coincidence," he said. "Do you really believe that?" said I. 2 days after our conversation? His eyes were wide, disbelieving. If he was acting, he was doing a very good job of it. But maybe it was fear of being exposed, or fear of Glyn. "You think one of the others took that child, took her into the woods to be sacrificed to the witch?" He paced the room. "What does the legend say the witch demanded? What did the townsfolk do in the stories?" I told him that the child was meant to be secured to a tree in the heart of the woods and left for the witch to take. Albert nodded. "You and I know there's no such thing as the widow. It was less than 24 hours ago, so if they did take her and tied her to a tree, she'd still be there. Are the police searching the woods?" "I don't know. I hear they're organising search parties now." He picked up his phone, and I asked him what he was doing. "Calling Glyn." "Are you mad? It could have been him." "It could have been you," he said to me. "It could have been any of us." "But you have less reason than the rest of us for doing it. You don't have children. That's why I came here." We stared at each other. "Do you believe in the widow?" he asked. "Of course not. Do you?" "No, I don't. But what did Shirley say? All it takes is for one person to believe. It could have been any of you. Any parent who was trying to protect their child." He was right. I knew it wasn't me. I didn't think it was David. He always seemed so rational. I'd even confessed to being an atheist because he couldn't believe in something for which there was no scientific proof. Glyn was the obvious suspect. I knew he could be cruel, that he was unfaithful and unafraid of violence. I'd seen him square up to men in the pub. At school, he was a bully. And his mother, she undoubtedly believed in the old stories. Glyn seemed to believe in them too. His one redeeming feature was that he doted on his daughter, Wendy. But would he really take and sacrifice another child because he believed she might be in danger? "We should go to the police," Albert said. "Tell them about our meeting and what Glyn said." Wait, let me think. I imagined myself talking to the police, accusing my fellow society member of this terrible crime. The thought of falsely accusing someone filled me with horror. And there was another reason not to go to the police, of which I am deeply, deeply ashamed. If the police took us seriously, they would want us all to provide alibis, wouldn't they? I couldn't do it, because I was out yesterday evening visiting a friend, and if I was forced to give an alibi, Sylvia would find out. I read this part out to Ollie. He sighed. "His friend. He mentions her in other parts of the journal. The old bastard was cheating on my mum. Just like the man who killed Priya. Men with secrets, flinching from justice. My opinion of Malcolm plummeted. I read the final paragraphs of the entry. I persuaded Albert that we should keep quiet. The chances were, I said, none of the members of the society had taken that girl. It was a coincidence. He agreed. The girl had probably wandered off, he said. She would turn up in a day or two. But on the way home, I made an anonymous call to the police from a phone box, advising them to search the woods, to look for signs that Caris had been tied to a tree, just in case. Chapter 36. In the following entry, Malcolm described the next meeting of the Historical Society. All four of them were there, along with Shirley. We all sat in silence at first, nobody quite daring to speak, shifty eyes flitting around the table. Shirley kept clutching her cross. Albert gave me meaningful glances, and David looked green around the gills. The girl still hasn't turned up, though I heard the police had searched the woods and interviewed known sex offenders in the area. The detective in charge of the investigation was quoted in the paper, saying it wasn't helpful that local people kept telling him the girl was taken by the widow, chosen because no one had given her an offering. Glynn leaned forward and looked around the table at each of us in turn. "So," he stage-whispered, "which one of you did it?" There was a flurry of denials and accusations. It descended into a fierce argument. I couldn't work out if Glynn was acting, cleverly trying to lay the blame at someone's feet, creating a smokescreen of confusion. "How about you, Glynn?" I said. "Was it you?" He smiled. "Perhaps what people are saying is right. Perhaps the widow came into town and took her." Absurd. But I couldn't work out if he actually believed that. I examined each of my so-called friends in turn. Was one of them guilty? More than one, perhaps, working together. What if it was all of them? Before we wrapped up, Glynn said, "At least she won't be missed. The girl, I mean. At least the widow didn't take anyone important." The entry ended there. Ollie said, "I flicked ahead, seeing if there were any more references to it. All I know is the girl was never found." "What do you think?" I asked. "Do you think one of them did it?" He shrugged. "I have no idea. I know a bloody witch didn't come into town to grab her, but it's a hell of a coincidence, isn't it, if she did just wander off. Did your dad ever say anything about it?" I set the journal aside, placing it next to my empty coffee cup. "No, not that I remember. I mean, I must have heard about the disappearance and the rumours." I explained the similarities to my novel. We moved away in 1981, a year after this happened. Maybe that's why. Maybe my dad wanted to get away. Ollie's eyes were wide. "You think it might have been him?" The very thought made me sick. "I don't know. It goes against everything I know about him." "Did your mum ever mention Carys and what happened?" I asked Heleth. "No." She'd picked up the journal and was flicking through it, as if the answer to all of this might be contained in its pages. "At least, not in any detail. She always said this town wasn't safe for children, that if I ever gave her grandchildren she would worry herself sick about them. But she never elaborated." She was distracted by the journal. "No, I mean, she told me about the widow. Every kid around here knows about her, but that's it." I got up and went over to the window. The sun was struggling to come out from behind the clouds. "What are you thinking?" Ollie asked. "I'm thinking that 35 years after Carys went missing, history repeated itself. A child was taken. A newcomer to the town, a family that weren't integrated into the community." "You think they did it again? With Lily Marsh?" I paced around. It can't be a coincidence. And Glynn Collins is the obvious suspect. Back in 1980, he thought he was protecting Wendy, or, sorry, Heleth, but I have to say it, Wendy and you. She met my eye but didn't say anything. I had to ask, "Is Glynn your dad?" She didn't answer for a few long seconds. "I don't know. Mum never told me." She'd gone pale, and now I felt terrible. "Let's leave it, eh?" Ollie said, putting a protective hand on his girlfriend's shoulder. "Okay, yes, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't make any difference to what we're talking about. Glynn could have been protecting Wendy, and maybe this time he was trying to protect his granddaughter Megan." Ollie gaped at me. "Glynn Collins," he said. "He's always scared me. Back when I was a kid, I mean." Heleth had set the journal aside and was deep in thought, tuned out of the conversation. "Glynn met Lily through his granddaughter Megan," I said. "She knew him. It would have been easy for him to lure her away. Maybe tell her she needed to go with him to see something. She would probably have trusted him. Now he's got it in for me, too. He knows I've been nosing around." The back of my head, where it was still bandaged, was beginning to throb again. "But he's got a rock-solid alibi for the night I was attacked." I thought about that. Was somebody helping him? If so, who? Ollie was agitated. "You know what I said about keeping all this secret? About protecting our dad's reputations? I think we're beyond that now, aren't we? We should go to the police. Show them the journal." "There's no point. Last time I talked to them, they dismissed me as a writer with an overactive imagination.
Let me do it, Heleth said. I'm local, and I get on well with the policeman who was there when Mum died.
I bet you did, Ollie muttered, which made Heleth roll her eyes. I think it's a good idea, I said to Ollie. They might listen to her.
I suppose so. Maybe I could come with you.
She hesitated, and I thought I could tell what she was thinking, that the police would respond better to her solo. Perhaps it's best if Heleth goes on her own? In the first instance, anyway, I said. Ollie grunted, and we lapsed into silence again. I parted the curtains and peeked out at the street, paranoid that someone was watching us, that Glyn would come here looking for Malcolm's missing journal. Heleth's phone rang, and she said, "Excuse me," before taking it out of the room. Ollie watched her go, then picked up the journal, flicked to the relevant entry, and tapped the page. "Something just struck me. Albert Patterson. You know, he lived at Ninth Bran." I nodded, even though it hurt to do so. "That's a weird bloody connection, isn't it? Lily Marsh disappearing after living in that house. If Albert hadn't died, 5 or 6 years ago, I'd say he was the prime suspect. Plus, he didn't have kids, did he? Like your dad said, he had no one to protect from the widow, so why would he do it? Did you ever meet him?" I thought about the photo I'd found hidden in the book at the retreat, the tall, skinny man and his stern-faced wife. "Yeah, I went to his house a couple of times when I was a kid. He was all right. Nice bloke, actually. He loved kids, even though he didn't have any of his own. Loved playing with us, keeping us entertained while the other adults stood in the kitchen and chatted about boring stuff." Heleth came back in. "That was the estate agent," she said to Ollie, who nodded. The pain in my head was getting worse. I stood up. "I should go." "What are you going to do?" Ollie asked, showing me to the door. "I don't know. This headache is making it hard to think straight. But I'll call you later." "All right. If you see Glyn, don't say anything to him, okay? Not yet." Heleth kissed my cheek as I left. "I'll let you know what the police say about the journal." "Thanks." They stood side by side, their faces pale with worry. "Be safe," I said. I drove back towards the retreat, a wall of white noise inside my head. Fortunately, the roads were quiet and I was able to drive on autopilot. Halfway back, my phone rang. It was that detective, D.C. Hawkins. I ignored the call. I didn't feel ready to talk to her yet. I stopped at a petrol station and bought a pack of extra-strong painkillers, ignoring the warning on the packet and gobbling 3. Then I pulled over by the side of the road, killed the engine, and closed my eyes. The silence was broken only by the occasional passing car and the gentle bleating of sheep in an adjacent field. I emptied my mind and waited for the paracetamol to kick in and rub away the sharp edges of my headache. By the time I reached the retreat, I was feeling better. As I went in, I saw Ursula coming down the stairs. She had a sheet of paper in her hand. She looked even more wild-eyed than she had earlier. "Have you seen Julia?" she demanded. "I've just got home." "Oh, you're no use." She stalked off into the kitchen. Susie appeared, carrying her suitcase down the stairs. "You're going?" I said. She didn't answer with words, but with a look of panic. She looked dreadful, washed out, her hair lank, and with rings around her eyes. "I saw her," she said. "What? Who?" "Lily. I went for a final walk in the woods to say goodbye, and I saw her." She hugged herself. "She was there, in the distance. And then she vanished." "What are you talking about?" Goose pimples rippled across my arms. It was like she was made of smoke or mist. She was dressed in red. Red, like blood. I need to tell Julia." She started towards the kitchen. I grabbed her arm. Everyone here was going crazy, haunted by visions in the woods. It had to be group hysteria, a swirl of grief stirred up and encouraged by Ursula. "No, you're not going to tell Julia." "Tell me what?" Julia appeared at the top of the staircase. She came down towards us. "Oh, Julia, I saw her. I saw Lily." Susie shook me off. "I saw her ghost." I wanted to scream. Julia was staring at Susie, arms wrapped around herself. I took hold of Susie's arm again, more gently this time. "Come on, Susie. You're clearly in shock after what happened to Max. You should rest." Then Ursula came out of the kitchen and spotted Julia.
Ah, there you are. The wound on the back of my head pulsed. Ursula flapped the sheet of paper she was holding at Julia. Her eyes bulged. My guide. She came to me again. She told me where to find proof that Lily has left this realm. I stepped between them. Julia, don't listen to this. It's insane. Julia pushed me aside. Shut up, Lucas. She grabbed the sheet of paper from Ursula's hand. Susie had slid down the wall onto the floor and sat there, hugging her knees, rocking back and forth. What is this? Julia asked. I moved behind her and looked over her shoulder, staring at the lines and curves, the crosses and squiggles on the sheet of paper. It's a map, Ursula said. I drew you a map. Chapter 37. Lily, 2014. Lily sat on her bed, cradling Big Cat in her arms. She held him against her cheek and screwed her eyes shut. Mum and Dad were fighting again. When the hell were you going to tell me? Mum shouted. She couldn't make out Dad's reply. You're ruining us! Fucking ruining us! Lily winced at the swear word. Mum never swore, except when she was yelling at Dad. Lily wasn't totally sure what he'd done wrong, something to do with money and lying and broken promises, the usual stuff they argued about. Lily wished her parents could be more like the ones she saw on TV, parents who cracked jokes and put their arms around each other. Mum swore again, and Lily searched the room for her headphones. Where were they? She remembered. They were in her bag in the closet downstairs. She crept out of the room and down the stairs, opening the closet and pulling out her bag. The headphone wires were tangled up. She tried to unknot them, Chesney sitting blinking at her as she grappled with the stupid things. She wanted to ask Mum or Dad to help, but they were still screeching at each other. She heard Mum say that name again, Lana. Hot tears of frustration burned Lily's cheeks, and she chucked the bag and the stupid headphones back into the closet. Chesney jumped down from the windowsill and dashed to the front door, meowing to be let out. Lily opened the door and watched him slink across the lawn. She wished she was free too. I've had enough, Mum yelled. So had Lily. Closing the door quietly behind her, she slipped out into the garden. She climbed over the fence into the overgrown meadow and entered the woods. It was still and quiet among the trees. Autumn leaves formed a carpet of red on the path. Lily imagined herself as a movie star, attending the premiere of her new film. Reporters asked her if she would ever forgive her parents, who deeply regretted how they'd behaved now she was a superstar. She was so engrossed in her fantasy that she wasn't sure if she was going in the right direction. Megan's house wasn't this way, was it? She paused, trying not to panic. Something moved in the trees. Lily went absolutely still. It's just a bird, she thought. A big bird, probably a magpie. There were loads of them around here. Crack. Lily tried to make her legs move, but it was as if her soles were superglued to the path. Her whole body had gone cold. It's a crow, it's a crow, she told herself, staring into the thick tangle of branches where the noise had come from, praying that she'd see black feathers, the bird flapping towards the sky. Instead, she saw a face. Eyes, peering at her through a gap in the branches. Lily tore her feet from the path and ran blindly, realizing within seconds she was still heading away from her house, but unable to stop and turn. It's the widow! The widow! She crashed through long-hanging branches, leaves clawing at her hair, almost slipping over in a muddy puddle that sucked at her converse. Tears blurred her vision. She could hardly see where she was going. The path branched left and right, and she stopped, paralyzed, unable to work out which way to go. She could sense the witch behind her. She tensed her shoulders, convinced that at any moment cold, clawed hands would reach out from the bushes and grab her. In the picture book Megan's granddad had given her, the widow was a young woman, dressed in red rags. She had long black hair and was as slim as the women on the covers of Mum's workout DVDs. She would be beautiful if it weren't for her face. Her eyes were as black as Big Cat's fur, and her mouth gaped open like a shark's, with long needle-like teeth. Lily had discussed this with Megan. The widow would be old now, so old, and the girls imagined her skin would be as wrinkled as a crocodile's. Her lips would be stained with the blood of all the children she'd eaten. Her breath would smell like kids' bones, and there would be torn flesh beneath her fingernails. There was a rustle behind her, and Lily gulped down a scream. She ran, heading left along the path, trying not to slip or fall, leaping over a knotty tree root that tried to grab her toes like it was the witch's helper. Now she imagined the trees had faces, that they were watching her, laughing at her. Why had she left her house? It was all Mum and Dad's fault. Well, when the witch caught her and ate her up and her bones were never found, they'd be sorry, and they'd wish and wish they hadn't fought, that they'd spent their time loving their only daughter instead. It would almost be worth it. Just as she'd resigned herself to being caught, convinced the trees were closing in on her, forming a wooden cage around her, she saw a clearing up ahead, light entering the woods, buildings beyond. She sped up and, heart bursting with relief, flew out of the trees onto the estate where Megan lived. And there was Megan, standing outside her house. Jake was there too. They were playing a game of tag on the front lawn. Lily ran across the road to them. "What's the matter?" Megan asked. "You look like someone's chasing you." Lily panted. She couldn't speak for a moment. Her lungs burned, and her heart was going bang, bang, bang. "It's the widow," she said. "I saw her." Both Megan and Jake gawped at her. "What was that?" Lily spun round. It was Megan's granddad, coming out of the garage. There was another man with him, but he was concealed by shadows. "Lily saw the widow," Megan told him. "Do your Mum and Dad know you're here?" asked Mr. Collins, ignoring what Megan had said. Lily was surprised. He was acting like she'd said something silly and childish. She shook her head. "I ran away." "Really? Well, I'm glad you didn't go too far. Do you want to go home? I don't know how long you've been gone, but I'm sure they'll be worried about you." Lily tried to stop the tears coming, but she had no control over them. She could feel her face going bright red, too. She hated crying. She knew it made her look like an ugly red frog. Everyone was staring at her. "I tell you what," said Megan's granddad, handing her a clean handkerchief. His voice was kind. "You go inside and play with Megan for a little bit, and I'll call your parents. How does that sound?" This time, all she could do was nod. As soon as Megan shut her bedroom door, she said, "I can't believe you saw the widow. What did she look like?" Unbelievably, she sounded jealous. I don't want to talk about it." "Oh, come on, don't be a baby. Did she look like she does in the book?" Lily sat down on Megan's bed and pulled Megan's giant teddy bear towards her. Megan's granddad had bought it for her. It wore a little rosette that said, "World's Best Granddaughter." Lily stifled another sob. She didn't have any grandparents. Maybe if she did, she could go and live with them. "Tell me," Megan urged. She had found her copy of Folk Tales and Urban Myths, which fell open at the page they were always poring over. "Did she look like this?" "I only saw her eyes." Megan's voice dropped to an awed whisper. "Were they black?" I don't know." "What about her skin? Was it all wrinkly? Were her lips stained with blood?" "I didn't see." Megan made a disgusted noise. "Oh, you're useless." Anger pulsed at Lily's temples. She was not useless. "I was too busy running to take a proper look." "Yeah, a big scaredy cat. If it had been me, well, it wasn't you." Lily cut her off. It had been a terrible day, the worst day of her whole life. She felt a hot bubble of hatred expand inside her, an urge to lash out. "I didn't see her properly," Lily said, "but I heard her." Megan's eyes almost popped out of her head. "What did she say?" Lily pointed a finger at her best friend's face. "She said your name. She said, Megan." Later, remembering Megan's look of terror, the way she'd flinched, would make Lily feel bad, but in that moment it was delicious. "Lily?" It was Megan's granddad. "Your dad's here." Lily ran down the stairs and out the front door. Dad was talking to Mr. Collins, his hands on his hips. He noticed Lily and turned around. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, putting his arm around her. "What are we going to do with you?" She didn't respond. As Dad took her hand and led her to the car, the other man who'd been in the garage came out, wiping his oily hands on a rag. It was Mr. Wallace, the man who did work in their garden sometimes. "Hi, Rodri." Dad said, as he unlocked the car. Rhodri Wallace waved as they drove away, but he wasn't smiling. It was weird. If Lily didn't know better, she'd swear he looked scared. Chapter 38. It was 5:30. Just 2 hours of daylight remained. I suggested to Julia that we wait until morning, but she wouldn't hear of it. I didn't even bother trying to persuade her that Ursula's map had to be a con or a fantasy, not after our argument that morning. Julia had to find out for herself. She grabbed a little rucksack and threw in 2 flashlights, along with a bottle of water and a small pair of shears, in case we need to cut our way through any overgrown vegetation. Ursula had gone back to her room, saying she was too tired to come along, leaving us with the map. It was crudely drawn, like a child's sketch of a pirate treasure map. The retreat was situated at the southern tip of this map. Beyond that were the woods where I'd gone walking that first day. Near the top was a large X, which, according to Ursula, indicated where we would find the proof. Despite my scepticism, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was impossible not to get sucked into Ursula's fantasy. The boy in me could not resist a map where X marked the spot. "Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked Julia a final time. "It might be more sensible to call the police and let them look." "I'm not waiting any longer, Lucas. I need to see. I need to know." "I'm coming with you. No arguments, okay?" She shrugged. Julia took a photo of the map with her phone, so we had a backup copy. Her hand trembled, and it took 2 attempts to stop the photo from blurring. 2 years of bouncing between despair and hope. 2 years of grieving with no body to say goodbye to. 2 years of believing that Lily was still out there, still alive. It was all there on her face, in the tension that vibrated through her bones. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs, and turned to me. "Let's go." Walking across the garden, I checked back over my shoulder. Ursula was watching from an upstairs window, her face inscrutable. She caught me looking and let the curtain fall back. The path was dry, cracks snaking through the mud. Blossom coated the branches of the trees near the perimeter of the woods. Catkins hung above our heads, and songbirds called out to one another. If it weren't for Julia's brisk pace and the grim determination on her face, this would have felt like a pleasant late-afternoon ramble. I wanted to talk to Julia, to tell her everything I'd learned from Malcolm's journal, but I needed all my breath to keep up with her. It could wait. I was certain we weren't going to find anything. We'd be home in an hour or 2, and I could talk to her then. I also wanted to talk to Mum, ask her what she knew about the Historical Society. Surely Dad had said something during that time when Caris Driscoll went missing. An image came to me. Glyn Collins, 37 years younger, carrying a little girl into these woods, maybe heading along this very path. Was the story about the widow a smokescreen? A convenient tale for a paedophile to hide behind? What if seeing Lily playing with his granddaughter had stirred a sick desire in Glyn, a desire that had lain buried for a long time? She looked similar to Caris, though Lily was older. It was easy to imagine. He'd got away with it last time. He thought he could do so again. Before leaving the house, I'd sent Ollie a text explaining what was going on. He'd replied straight away, telling me Heleth was on her way to the police station with the journal. I was keen to hear about their response. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, slowing down as we approached the edge of the woods. Watery sunshine flowed through the treetops, and light danced on Julia's hair. It was inappropriate to think it right now, but she was beautiful. I knew I could never be satisfied with a single night we'd spent together. But, like all the other things I wanted to say to her, it would have to wait. "I was thinking about Lily," I said vaguely. "I want Ursula to be wrong." Julia stopped walking. "How do you think it feels?" she said. "Not knowing, being stuck in limbo." She looked around, turning her face upwards and shielding her eyes against the light. Branches and twigs formed a lattice against the sky. "Sometimes I think I can feel her here, her presence. If she did die here—" She swallowed. "Julia, quiet, please. I think a part of her is still here, in these woods. She's there in the blossom, in the leaves that bud every spring, in the grass that grows on the path. I couldn't feel her before, but now I can." A tear slid down her cheek. "She's watching me." It was silent all around us. Even the birds had fallen quiet. "If we find proof, like Ursula says, at least then I'll be able to take comfort in knowing she's still here." I nodded, afraid of choosing the wrong words. "And then I'll know it's okay to join her."